May 24, 1940. A village called Münster Eifel, tucked away in western Germany. Inside the Führer's headquarters, Adolf Hitler stood frozen over a map table, his eyes tracing the positions of German forces that had just pulled off what military analysts would later call the most devastating blitz in modern warfare. 17 days. That's all it took. 17 days to accomplish what the Kaiser's armies couldn't achieve in 4 brutal years of World War I. His forces had torn through the Ardennes like a hurricane, splitting the Allied armies clean in two, driving the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army into a shrinking death trap against the English Channel. 300,000 Allied soldiers, pinned against the sea at Dunkirk. German panzers? Less than 15 miles away. The jaws of the trap were closing, and every German general knew it. This was the kill shot, the moment that would end the war. And then, Hitler spoke 3 words that would echo through history like a curse. The armored divisions are to remain at medium artillery range from Dunkirk. Permission is only granted for reconnaissance and protective movements. The Halt Order, 3 words that changed everything. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, felt his blood run cold. That night, he would write in his diary with such fury that his pen carved indentations through the page beneath. His words trembled with disbelief. The Führer is terribly nervous, frightened by his own success. He's afraid to take any chance, and so would rather pull the reins on us. Halder had dedicated his entire life to this moment. The enemy was cornered, broken. The panzers were ready, engines roaring, crews eager. Every principle of military doctrine screamed the same command. Press the advantage. Never stop. Never give a wounded enemy time to breathe. But Hitler wasn't a career military strategist. He was a former corporal, a survivor of the trenches. He'd spent 4 endless years in the mud of Flanders during the Great War, and those memories haunted him like ghosts. The fields around Dunkirk weren't like the open terrain his tanks had dominated during their lightning drive to the coast. This was Flanders, low-lying, crisscrossed with canals and drainage ditches, the same waterlogged killing ground that had swallowed entire armies in the previous war. He could still see it, the mud that killed more men than bullets, shell holes that became liquid graves, attacks that simply stopped, drowning in the earth itself. The tank attack planned for tomorrow will not take place, Hitler told Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A. His voice was firm, final. Dunkirk is to be left to the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring had been whispering in Hitler's ear for hours. The Reichsmarschall, commander of the Luftwaffe, saw a golden opportunity. His air force had played second fiddle to the army throughout the French campaign. The panzers grabbed all the glory, all the headlines, all the praise. But here, with the British trapped on open beaches with nowhere to hide, his bombers could deliver the finishing blow. Göring had made a personal promise to Hitler, standing close, his voice dripping with confidence. My Luftwaffe will complete the encirclement and destroy the British on the beaches. I guarantee it. Hitler wanted desperately to believe him. More than that, he needed to believe him. The panzer divisions had been driving without rest for 2 solid weeks. Maintenance crews worked around the clock. But tank tracks were disintegrating. Engines were screaming for overhaul. Nearly 50% of the German armor was in various states of mechanical breakdown. But beyond the mechanical concerns lurked something darker, something Hitler felt deep in his gut since the breakthrough at Sedan. This entire campaign was happening too fast, too easily. The French were supposed to be the finest army in Europe. They'd collapsed in days. The British were supposed to be unbreakable. They were running. It felt like a trap, like the enemy was deliberately luring him into overextension, into some catastrophic mistake that would shatter his perfect victory into pieces. At 11:42 a.m. on May 24th, the order rippled through German military channels like a shockwave. All panzer units were to halt immediately. They could defend their positions. They could conduct reconnaissance. But they were not, under any circumstances, to advance on Dunkirk. Lieutenant General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 99th Panzer Corps, received the order at his forward headquarters near Gravelines. His tanks were so close to Dunkirk that his crews could see the smoke columns rising from the burning port. Some of his forward elements had pushed to within 10 miles of the beaches. His panzers had just covered over 200 miles in 11 days, averaging nearly 20 miles per day through enemy territory, across rivers, through fortified towns, against resistance that melted like snow before their guns. They were exhausted, but electrified, running on pure adrenaline and the knowledge that they were witnessing something unprecedented in military history. The order to halt hit them like a punch to the gut. Guderian would write later, his words barely containing his rage. "We were utterly speechless. This was the chance of the century, and it was being thrown away for reasons we could not comprehend." But the order stood, and for the next 48 critical hours, the most powerful armored force ever assembled in human history sat idle. 15 miles away, the British began to evacuate. The evacuation wasn't supposed to work. It couldn't work. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding from the ancient stone walls of Dover Castle across the Channel, had been told to prepare Operation Dynamo on May 20th. The Admiral's initial assessment was brutal. If they were very, very lucky, they might save 30 to 45,000 men before the Germans overran the beaches. The rest, the vast majority of the British Expeditionary Force, would be killed or captured. It would be the greatest military disaster in British history. Ramsay started gathering every vessel he could find: Royal Navy destroyers, passenger ferries, fishing boats, private yachts, anything that could cross the Channel and take on men. The call went out on May 27th, a desperate plea to civilian boat owners. Send all particulars to the Admiralty within 14 days if your vessel has not already been offered or requisitioned. 14 days. They didn't have 14 days. They might not have 14 hours. On the beaches at Dunkirk, men from the British Expeditionary Force were arriving in growing waves. Private Frederick Carter, 19 years old, from Manchester, part of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, had been fighting a rearguard action for 3 days straight without sleep. His unit had been ordered to hold a canal crossing while other units withdrew. They'd held that position until their ammunition ran dry, then pulled back themselves, moving only at night, hiding during the day, always hearing the German tanks getting closer, closer, closer. When they finally reached Dunkirk on May 27th, Carter saw something that would be burned into his memory forever. The beaches stretched for miles, and they were covered with men. Tens of thousands of them, standing in lines that ran from the dunes straight down into the water. Orderly lines, like they were queuing for a bus in London on a Tuesday morning, except these lines went directly into the sea. Men standing in water up to their chests, waiting their turn, waiting for ships that might never come. The town behind them was an inferno. German artillery was finding the range. Stukas were beginning to appear overhead, their sirens screaming like demons as they dove. And there were almost no ships, Carter would say later, his voice still carrying the disbelief of that impossible moment. "I thought we were done for. I truly did. There were so many of us, and the sea was so empty. I remember thinking about my mom, about how she'd get the telegram. Missing in action." That's what they'd tell her. Missing, like I'd just wandered off somewhere and couldn't find my way home. But something was happening that the Germans didn't know about yet. Something that Hitler's Halt Order had given just enough time to organize. The little ships were coming. On May 26th, the same day Hitler finally lifted the Halt Order and allowed the panzers to advance again, the first civilian vessels began arriving at Dunkirk. The Sundowner, a private yacht owned by Charles Lightoller, the most senior officer to survive the Titanic's sinking 28 years earlier. The Tamzine, a fishing boat from Margate. The new Prince of Wales, a Thames pleasure steamer that normally took tourists on river cruises. Dozens of them, then hundreds, crossing the Channel in weather that swung from dead calm to choppy seas and back again. Navigating through minefields, under constant German air attack, old men and young boys manning boats that were never meant for war. Hitler was at the Felsenest, his headquarters nestled in the Eifel Hills. when reports started filtering in about the scale of the evacuation. The Luftwaffe had been bombing the beaches for 2 solid days. Göring kept assuring him that the British were being slaughtered, that the evacuation was a futile gesture, that most of the BEF would never make it off those beaches, but the numbers told a very different story. May 27th, 7,669 men evacuated. May 28th, 70,804 men. May 29th, 47,310 men. May 30th, 53,822 men. Hitler's confidence began to crack like ice under pressure. He told General Alfred Jodl, his chief of operations staff, "They're getting away. Göring promised me his Luftwaffe could stop them." Jodl, who had been skeptical of the Halt Order from the very beginning, said nothing. What could he say? The decision had been made. The critical 48 hours had been lost. The panzers were advancing now, but the British had used that precious time to establish a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk, and they were defending it with absolutely desperate courage at Cassel, a small town on a hill south of Dunkirk. The 2nd Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment had been ordered to hold their position to the last man. They were surrounded by elements of 6 German divisions. They had no hope of evacuation, no hope of reinforcement, no hope of survival. Their job? Buy time for 2 days. Approximately 200 men held off thousands of German troops. They fought from houses, from cellars, from rubble. When they ran out of ammunition, they fought with bayonets. When the Germans finally overran the position on May 29th, only 30 men were still alive to surrender. The German troops were genuinely stunned by the resistance they encountered. This wasn't an army en route. This wasn't panic. These men were fighting like they had something sacred to prove, like they were defending their homes, not covering a retreat. And every hour they held was another hour for ships to load at Dunkirk. Another 1,000 men who might make it home. Another 1,000 lives saved. May 31st, 68,014 men evacuated. June 1st, 64,429 men. The numbers kept climbing. The Luftwaffe kept attacking, but the Royal Air Force was flying constant patrols over the beaches now, and the weather refused to cooperate. Low clouds, rain squalls, conditions that grounded bombers and made accurate bombing nearly impossible. Göring's ironclad guarantee was turning into a public humiliation. On June 2nd, Hitler met with his senior commanders at Brûlé-de-Pêche, his new headquarters in Belgium, closer to the front lines. The mood in the room was strange. They'd won. France was defeated. The British were running. But something felt profoundly wrong. General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, would remember Hitler's words that day with crystal clarity. "The British have gotten away. We should have destroyed them on the beaches, but they've escaped. This will prolong the war." There was no rage in Hitler's voice, no shouting. That would come later. This was something else entirely. Realization. The cold, creeping understanding that he'd made a mistake, that the Halt Order had been an error, that Göring had failed spectacularly, that 300,000 trained soldiers were going to make it back to England, to fight another day. But he couldn't admit it. Not to his generals. Not yet. Instead, he offered explanations, rationalizations. The terrain had been unsuitable for tanks. The Luftwaffe had done everything possible. The British had fought better than expected. The weather had been unfortunate. These things happened in war, Halder wrote in his diary that night. The Führer is looking for someone to blame. By June 4th, when the last ships pulled away from Dunkirk's burning harbor, the final count was staggering. 226 men evacuated. The British had expected to save maybe 30,000. They'd saved more than 10 times that number. They'd lost everything else. All their tanks, all their artillery, all their trucks and equipment. Thousands of men killed or captured. But the core of the British Army had survived. Churchill would tell Parliament with characteristic honesty, "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." But he knew, and Hitler knew, that something profoundly significant had happened. The British had been given hope. They'd seen their army snatched from the jaws of destruction. They'd seen ordinary people in small boats risk their lives to bring their soldiers home. It would be infinitely harder now to convince them to surrender, to accept peace terms, to acknowledge that the war was lost. Hitler's public statements about Dunkirk were carefully constructed, meticulously crafted. On June 5th, he issued a proclamation. The greatest battle in world history has ended. The British Expeditionary Force has been destroyed. 3 French armies have been annihilated or captured. He emphasized the victory. The equipment captured. The prisoners taken. He didn't mention the 338,000 who got away. But privately, the recriminations were beginning. Göring fell from favor. The Luftwaffe's failure at Dunkirk would haunt it for the rest of the war. Hitler began to second-guess his generals more frequently, to trust his own instincts over their military expertise. The Halt Order became a wound that never healed, a decision that couldn't be undone, a mistake that compounded itself as the war dragged on. In the months and years that followed, Hitler would offer wildly different explanations for the Halt Order depending on his audience and his mood. To some, he claimed it had been a deliberate gesture, a magnanimous offer to let the British escape with their lives, so they might be more willing to negotiate peace. "I purposely let the British escape," he told one visitor with false confidence. "I didn't want to provoke them into fighting to the last man." But the people who were there, who'd heard him in May 1940, knew this was pure revision. Hitler had expected the Luftwaffe to destroy the BEF on the beaches. He'd believed Göring's promises. He'd been cautious about the terrain. He'd been nervous about overextending his armor. But he hadn't been magnanimous. He'd been wrong, to others. Hitler blamed von Rundstedt, claiming the Halt Order had been the field marshal's idea, and he'd merely approved it. There was some truth to this. Von Rundstedt had recommended a pause to consolidate forces, but Hitler had expanded that pause, extended it, kept the panzers idle even when his field commanders were literally begging to advance. The decision had been his. The responsibility was his. In 1945, as the Reich collapsed around him in flames and rubble, Hitler would return to Dunkirk in his conversations like a man picking at a wound that wouldn't heal. Albert Speer, his armaments minister, remembered Hitler saying in the bunker beneath Berlin, as Soviet shells rained down above, "If I had destroyed the British at Dunkirk, the war might have ended differently. That was my first great mistake, not his only mistake, not even his greatest mistake by that point, but the first, the one that set the pattern, the moment when he'd had total victory in his grasp, and let it slip through his fingers." The soldiers who'd escaped from Dunkirk would form the core of the British Army that fought in North Africa, in Italy, in Normandy. Frederick Carter, the 19-year-old private who'd thought he was going to die on that beach, would survive the war. He'd fight at El Alamein. He'd land in Normandy on D-Day +3. He'd be part of the liberation of Brussels. And he would always remember standing in the water at Dunkirk, waiting for a ship that he didn't think would come, hearing German artillery getting closer, and then seeing the small boats appearing through the smoke like ghosts. "That's when I knew we hadn't lost," he'd say decades later, his eyes distant with memory. "We were beaten, but we hadn't lost. The Germans had us trapped, but we got away. And once we got away, we could come back." He paused and smiled. And we did come back. The Halt Order lasted 48 hours. In military terms, it was a brief pause, a moment of caution in a campaign that had been defined by audacity and speed. But those 48 hours gave the British time to establish their defensive perimeter, time to organize the evacuation, time to start bringing the little ships across the channel. Without those 48 hours, Operation Dynamo might have saved 30,000 men instead of 300,000. The British Army might have ceased to exist as a fighting force. Churchill might have been forced to negotiate. The war might have ended in 1940. Hitler knew this. His generals knew this. And as the war dragged on, as the Reich faced enemies on every front, as the certainty of victory turned into the grinding certainty of defeat, Dunkirk became a symbol of what might have been. The moment when everything was possible. And one decision, one Halt Order, changed everything. In his last recorded conversation about Dunkirk in March 1945, Hitler told Jodl with quiet bitterness, "I should have let Guderian finish them. I should have ignored Göring. I should have trusted the panzers." It was as close as Hitler ever came to admitting he'd been wrong. But by then, it didn't matter. The men who'd escaped from Dunkirk were back. They'd crossed the Channel again, this time going the other way, landing on the beaches of Normandy. The war Hitler thought he'd won in May 1940 was ending in the ruins of Berlin, and somewhere in the wreckage of his 1,000-year Reich, buried under all the other catastrophic decisions and criminal orders and strategic blunders, was the Halt Order of May 24, 1940. The order that let 338,000 British soldiers escape. The order Hitler couldn't take back. The order he'd spend the rest of his life trying to explain